I dreamt about being a journalist because my mom worked nights in the hospital as a nurse, and I would spend a lot of time at my grandparents' house. And my grandfather of a generation that, World War II, he was a lieutenant in the Army, came back, worked in the post office, but he was super well read. Super well read. He loved Sinclair Lewis. He loved John Steinbeck, but he really loved, Mike Royko, who was at the Chicago Tribune, some of the great, columnists of the times. And he would always tell me about, the newspapermen and what they did. And that's really what he loved H.L. Mencken, the social critic.
Sure.
And I grew up on those stories. And so, my goal was, my dream, I guess not my goal, my dream was to write for the New York Times, which again, if I'm painting an accurate picture of where I grew up, which was a former mill town that, even when I was born, its best years were 20 years ago. It was a crazy dream to have because I didn't know anybody who wrote for the New York Times for sure, but I also didn't know anybody who read the New York Times. I'd drive up to UMass in Amherst, and I'd read the New York Times there once I got a license. I'd go to our local library in Springfield, Massachusetts, and I'd read the New York Times there. So that was my dream, but it was really fostered by my grandfather and telling me all these, amazing stories about the journalists that he idolized.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun about all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to the Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today's episode is brought to you by Palacio and Partners, providing turnkey podcast creation, hosting, production, promotion, and related creative resources for you and your business. Today, Jeff is interviewing Paul Sullivan. Paul is the founder of Company of Dads, a media company, community platform, and workplace educator founded in 2022 with the mission of helping families fulfill their full potential. Paul is also the co-host of Bright Horizons Work-Life Equation podcast. Before starting the Company of Dads, Paul wrote the Wealth Matters column in the New York Times for 13 years. He also created the Money Game column in Golf magazine. As a journalist, his articles have appeared in Fortune, Money, Condé Nast Portfolio, the International Herald Tribune, Barron's, the Boston Globe, and Food and Wine. From 2000 to 2006, he was reporter, editor, and columnist at the Financial Times. He got his start as a reporter at Bloomberg and institutional investor. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Paul.
Paul, welcome to the Corporate Couch this morning.
Jeff, thanks for having me.
Yeah, very excited to talk to you. Michael Amarino in Kansas City and introduced us, and Michael's fantastic, and you're fantastic. You have such an interesting background. What I love, I think this week was my 188th episode of the Corporate Couch, and it's just fascinating people's career journeys. And yours is, you're the first New York Times writer to appear on the podcast, as well as Golf Magazine, Golf Digest. And I can't wait to talk about the Company of Dads, the company, the organization you started. So, it's going to be fantastic. But let's start with a fun question, Paul. How about, even though people that know you fairly well, what one thing would surprise them about you?
That all my cars are white.
And why is that?
Great follow-up question. The reason all my cars are white is almost 20 years ago, we were living in Boston, in Beacon Hill, and there's this person a couple doors down who was running for governor, and they did a profile on his family, and they talked, and his wife, who was quite accomplished in her own right, said that they would only drive white cars because it's the safest car on the road. And my wife read this and said, when we have kids, we must only drive white cars. And at the time, we had a light gray car, which is evidently the most dangerous color of car that you can drive. Like, I'm not making that part up. Like, when you look at all the safety records. And so ever since then, when we got rid of that gray car, we've only had white cars, to the point where at one point I was dropping my dog years ago off at summer camp. And one of the little counselors, some teenager said, I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, we've all been wondering, it seems like all the cars in your family are white. Is that is that on purpose? And we're like, well, yes, it is, honey. This is why. So,
very observant.
Very observant.
Young adult. There you go. Love that. Paul, where'd you grow up and what was fun for you growing up?
I grew up in Western Massachusetts in a town called Ludlow, which is exit 7 off of the Mass Pike. And what was fun for me growing up was dreaming of never living there again. That was really what drove me in pretty much everything I did. As I say, my parents, they were very bad at being married, and turns out they're even worse at being divorced. And so I was very fortunate, and I got to go to the local private school on scholarship, and it's called Wilbraham Munson Academy, and it changed my life because I got there, and then I knew if I did well there, which I did, I'd be able to go to this magical place called college. And once you got to this magical place called college, you would never ever have to go back to your hometown again. And that's more or less, Jeff, exactly what I did. Wow. And so when I was not dreaming of not being where I was, I swam a lot, I read a lot, I played golf, I still play a lot of golf. Those are all things that I did with my maternal grandfather, who was a retired postal worker, and he would take me for swim lessons. He'd play golf with me and his buddies, and so that was a joyful part of my childhood for sure.
Love it. So did he carry the leather bag? Did he deliver, or did he work in the actual post office?
I thought when you were saying carry the leather bag, like, do we have an old timey like golf bag and we go out like like Francis Wilmette or something like that?
Yeah, with the Ben Hogan wooden.
That's right. No, I was like, oh well, no, he did at one point have a leather bag. That's a weird question. No, you actually meant no. He worked in the post office itself, in the sorting and all that. So he was not out walking a route.
Yeah, my senior year in college, I worked in the mailroom, and I actually carried the leather bag, delivered mail on campus. So it was kind of a badass job.
It's a pretty great job because you would meet everybody, and I'll tell a funny story. I went to see my childhood best friend a couple weeks ago. He lives in Fort Worth, Texas, and we were going to play golf. And so ahead of it, I packed up my clubs to send him down, via Shipsticks, which is essentially, FedEx. I said, God, I got to drive half an hour to the nearest, FedEx. That's a real pain. So I went and I got a cup of coffee and get in the car. And then I see the FedEx truck, just like those ads that they run. They're like, oh, FedEx is here to save you. See the FedEx truck sitting there. And so I pull over and I said, oh, I'm sorry, sir. Is there can you take this? And he's like, oh, let me look. He's like, oh, yeah, I can take it. And he says, well, where do you live? And I tell him my address. And he says, oh, Sullivan. I said, yes. He's like, you order a lot of wine. I said, oh, you know me.
Love it.
Loved it.
Love it. There's so many good things unpacked there. We go wine. And I recall from our last conversation, maybe you're like a 4 handicap in golf, give or take.
That's it. Yep. Give or take.
Yeah. That's nice. I love that. Any aspirations, like when you were 10, 11 years old, besides get the hell out of your hometown? Did you dream about writing for the New York Times?
I did. I dreamt about being a journalist because my mom worked nights in the hospital as a nurse, and I would spend a lot of time at my grandparents' house. And my grandfather, of a generation that, World War II, he was a lieutenant in the Army, came back, worked in the post office, but he was super well-read. Super, super well-read. He loved Sinclair Lewis. He loved John Steinbeck, but he really loved, Mike Royko, who was at the Chicago Tribune, some of the great, columnists of the times. And he would always tell me about, the newspapermen and what they did. And that's really what he loved H.L. Mencken, the social critic.
Sure.
And I grew up on those stories. And so, my goal was, my dream, I guess not my goal, my dream was to write for the New York Times, which again, if I'm painting an accurate picture of where I grew up, which was a former mill town that, even when I was born, its best years were 20 years ago. It was a crazy dream to have because I didn't know anybody who wrote for the New York Times for sure, but I also didn't know anybody who read the New York Times. I'd drive up to UMass in Amherst, and I'd read the New York Times there once I got a license. I go to our local library in Springfield, Massachusetts, and I'd read the New York Times there. So that was my dream, but it's really fostered by my grandfather and telling me all these, amazing stories about the journalists that he idolized.
Yeah. What were some impactful books for you when you were growing up? Just that you read more than once, or what?
Oh, probably because of my grandfather. I mean, the most impactful book when I was a kid, and I remember doing a report on this in like 5th or 6th grade, and the teacher's like, "What are you doing?" It was Of Mice and Men, and John Steinbeck of Mice and Men, about, kindness and cruelty and friendship and all those things that are really essential to becoming an adult, that at some point understanding those. And the teacher's like, this is kind of a strange book for a 5th grader. Like, don't you want to do like Encyclopedia Brown? I was like, no, I love this book. And so, but my grandfather and I, we read all of Steinbeck. We read, like I said, a lot of Sinclair Lewis, like Babbitt, and all those books, and we would talk about it. And so those are books that were, I had somebody to talk about them with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love to read as a child, and still do. I had a traumatic experience in senior year in high school with Mr. Rosenblatt. He made us read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Yeah. Of course, the Cliff Notes were big when I was in school, and I not only did I not understand the book, I could barely understand the Cliff Notes. So that was, but we could talk about that offline. So yeah, you had this magical experience, got a scholarship into a really nice school, and what was your decision-making process to go to Trinity College?
Oh, I owe, if I owe a lot to Wilbraham Munson, I owe just slightly less to Trinity, because of all the schools I got into. Trinity was the only one that understood my very complicated family situation, and how my family, my parents were really at war. And we had no money. And so it was like, who's going to fill out the financial aid form, who's not? And I got into some other great schools. I won't name and shame them now, but they could never wrap their head around how this, white kid coming from a prep school could have all this crazy family drama. And Trinity, based on, which is in Hartford, Connecticut, understood it intuitively. And they gave me, basically full financial aid to attend. And that was just, to this day, if they ask for anything from me as an alum, I jump to it, because without them, I don't know where I'd be in life.
Yeah. And was history your original major? Because a lot of people changed during the 4-year process, but and if it was, why history?
You have to understand that I literally knew nothing. Like, I didn't have people in my town who could mentor me. I didn't have family who could really, mentor me. I was, the first kid to do something like this. And so I set all this up as the punchline, because I like taking art history classes. And I was like, boy, art history, this is really interesting. I had no experience with art growing up. I was like, wow, this is so interesting. I was like, yeah, I don't know. I shouldn't be an art history major. I'm going to do something practical. I'll be a history major. And that was literally the mindset there. And I'll tell you this, years later, I was at a Trinity event for like incoming freshmen out where I live. And one of my friends was there who has had a very successful career as an investment banker. And I got up and told the version of that story. And I said, I was worried if I majored in art history, like my friend Charlie, who majored in art history, who had the very successful career as an investment banker, it wouldn't be very practical. And Charlie starts laughing, because he was an art history major and went on to, work in healthcare as an investment banker, showing you that, the value of a liberal arts education is it teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to, ask questions. It teaches you how to, be a lifelong learner, because, unless you become a high school history teacher, having a degree in history is not directly applicable to your job, but it is directly applicable to your ability to think and reason and hopefully be rational.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I've interviewed Heidi Lehman on my podcast, and she's a very successful serial entrepreneur, sold her company in the early 2000s to AOL, and she was an art history major.
Yeah.
And also grew up in Massachusetts. So there you go. And then I looked like you went right from Trinity to University of Chicago, which, was that a planned thing? Like to go right to your master's versus kind of working for a while?
Yeah, it's crazy in that. I love being a student. And again, like, all jokes aside, like I literally had no model. Like I didn't know, like I saw people back then, they're becoming consultants. I didn't really know what that was. I saw people becoming investment bankers. I didn't think I wanted to do that. I took a couple economics courses, didn't love it. And then I saw people trying to get into medical school or becoming a lawyer. And I thought, well, maybe I could become a lawyer, but I don't think I really want to do that either. And so I just was a great student. And so I was like, why don't I go and keep going? And so I actually was admitted into a PhD program with a fellowship at Chicago. And I said, okay, this is what I'll do. And I got there, and literally, Jeff, 3 days into it, I was like, what the heck have I done here? Like, this is not for me. Like, I'm seeing these people who 10 years on and they still haven't finished their PhD, and how specific you have to get. I was like, I don't think I love this enough. And so I said, well, I'm already here. I can't get a job at this point because, the hiring cycle's already passed. I might as well get my master's degree. And so I literally put my head down and got my master's degree in a year. And it was awesome. It was, I jokingly say that the University of Chicago was my finishing school, because, I grew up broke in a lower class town, lower class family. And like, could I do this? Could I compete with these people who had a lot more privilege than I had growing up? And the answer was yes. And so I give Chicago a lot of credit for giving me the confidence to then go forward and say, okay, let me give it a try. Let me see if I can become a journalist.
Right. Yeah. I always love to ask people, because it's so traumatic whether you finish high school or college, or go right from college to get a higher ed degree like a master's. How did you get the first job when like, oh, now I got to do work and get paid for it, and become an adult?
Yeah. So what I did was, I was lucky again. I hadn't spent all of my fellowship money, so I had some money left over, and I realized that my Spanish was pretty academic. It wasn't fluent in any way where I could use it. And so I spent the summer in Mexico. Spent the whole summer in Mexico, studied Spanish, traveled all around, and then I came back and I had a little bit of money. And my one of my good friends from high school, he had gone to Middlebury College, where he was what's called a Feb. And so they instead of going in September, they start the year in February, which means, 4 years later, they graduate in February. So just as, I was coming out of Chicago, he had taken that what would have been a spring semester and gone abroad. And so I said, why don't we get an apartment together? And so we got an apartment. We met this lovely guy who believed that we would eventually get jobs, and he let us rent his 1-bedroom apartment, which we divided up with bookcases. So like the living room became a bedroom and the living room, and then there was another bedroom. And I did what people did in the 1990s, and that was I opened up the New York Times, and I started applying for jobs. And my first job was at a newsletter publisher called Institutional Investor. They also put out a big business magazine. And but I probably had, I don't know, half a dozen interviews. I was interviewed to be a leg man for a food critic at the New York Post. And that seemed kind of like a fun job, but it didn't come to be. Other newsletters I interviewed for, I tried to interview at the AP, but they wanted to send me at the Associated Press. They wanted to send me someplace other than New York. And I really wanted to live in New York. And so I think I had maybe 4 months of money. And about the third month, I got a job, working for an institutional investor.
So did you have a career strategy? Because then you're an institutional investor, Bloomberg, Financial Times. Was that a kind of, hey, I'm going to write about money and people that have it? Or
no, not at all. I mean, my strategy is I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to figure out how I could write and pay my rent and have a life in the city. And being a business journalist was a way to do it. And the irony is that when you call New York, like most cities, it's a very credentialed place, and people always ask you, where'd you grow up, where'd you go to college, and where do you live today? Those are the 3 questions you get all the time. And so when I was starting as a business journalist, they'd ask me where I went to college, and as soon as I said Trinity, and I said the University of Chicago, all the business people. I mean, Chicago has more Nobel laureates in economics than any other school in America, and they did. Oh, okay. Well, you'll understand this. And never did they say, like, do you have a master's degree in history? They just assumed that it was economics or an MBA, and I never said no. That's not. I just I didn't lie, but we kind of went off to the races. And to me, it was about telling stories. But from the very beginning, I was trying to write books. I would get up early, and I probably wrote 3 books that never went anywhere before my first book came out years later. And that's what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to to write. I knew I wanted to write books, and I knew I had to find a way to do that and pay for myself.
So you got pushed into kind of the financial side of writing and focused on that. Kind of what was your big learnings, early on in your career, like, or things you didn't expect? Like, you come out of your master's program, you're like, holy shit, I didn't know being a writer, I had to do this. Did you have any of those experiences?
I guess there was a guy, sort of legendary editor of the newsletter division at II. His name is Tom Lamont. And he went to Penn. He was friends with George Steinbrenner. They evidently owned Resources together. He was right out of Central Casting. Like, in his office, there was like a jar of M&Ms and like Hershey Kisses, but he'd smoke the stinkiest, cheapest cigarillos you could imagine. Back when you could smoke
right
in and off, and he closed his door, which was absurd because all the smoke would come out from under it. And if you made a mistake in the story, he edited these newsletters because they're quite expensive, and it was all about inside skinny on stuff. If you made a mistake, he would make you call the person back. And so, as a 23-year-old trying to call somebody who, in retrospect was probably all of 28 or 29, and get them to walk you through the story again and walk you through the details so you actually understood it, that was painful for a 23-year-old. But it taught me quite quickly not to get off the phone until I had, all the answers I wanted. It also taught me that, never pretend that you know something when you don't. And so I would just keep asking questions and questions because it was far better to keep that person on the line for an extra 3 or 4 minutes than to spend 3 or 4 hours trying to track them down after the fact when Tom Lamont was yelling, you don't understand this.
Right.
So, but it was a great lesson.
Yeah.
And it's one I try to impart to my daughters. Like, if you don't understand something, put your hand up, ask a question.
Right.
The most successful, the most secure people are the ones who ask questions and don't pretend that they know everything. And the opposite is true for those who bluff through life and pretend that they know the answers when they really don't.
Yeah. Plus, you your clothes smelled like cigars when you left Mr.
Right.
Lamont's office.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, people can't even understand that people used to smoke in the office. And the progression was you could smoke anywhere, your desk, the hallways. And then, they migrate. Oh, you had a smoking room, which was, crazy because all the smokers went in the room. And if they opened the door, they had 10 smokers in there. Yeah. It was just like a whiff. Oh God!
But also the funny part is that Tom was so old school, and I've been in touch with him since then because he was so instrumental in launching the careers of dozens and dozens of business journalists. He would yell at you. He would yell at you old school, and I remember going to Bloomberg where they had this editor Matt Winkler who was there forever, and he was known for yelling, but he was more like a paper tiger. It was like performative yelling. And I remember the first time he yelled at me, somebody came over and like, "Are you okay?" And that's nothing. That guy's shooting blanks. You should see what it's like to be yelled at by Tom Lamont at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night when you can't go home until you somehow track this person down pre-cell phone.
Yeah. Paul, did you model your writing style after a favorite author? Obviously, you made it your own, but did you have kind of an influence there that you kind of?
I don't know if I would have an influence, but I was very lucky to have mentors early on, and two in particular who had nothing to do with business journalists whatsoever. One was a guy named Jay Perini, who is a novelist, a biographer, a poet, and the other is a guy named Alistair Reed, who spent a lot of his career in the Dominican Republic and then wrote for the New Yorker for years. And I did what I tell my daughters to do, again, back then pre-email, or I didn't know what their email was. I mean, we had email. I didn't know what their email was. It wasn't that easy. I wrote a letter. I wrote a letter to Jay Perini and said, he'd written a biography of John Steinbeck that I'd read with my grandfather. And I said, I really admire you and your writing. I read this book with my grandfather. I want to be a writer, but I'm not quite sure how to do it. And he picked up the phone and called me, and he left a message on my voicemail. And we had a very long friendship. And then he introduced me to Alistair Reed, who I'd read his stuff. I'd read about him. And Alistair, lived on the west side of West Village in Manhattan, and I was living in Hell's Kitchen. And he became such an integral part to my development as a writer. I would go down to his place, and we would have lunch. I got to know his wife, and it was magical. And to the point, but it was tough love. I mean, at one point, I was so excited. I'd written this book, and getting up at 5 a.m, right before going to work. It was a novel, and I gave it to him, and he called me up, and he says, Paul, you have to come down. You have to come down. We have to talk about it. Like, I'm so excited. This is great. We get down there, and he's holding the book, and he's holding the book in his hand, and he opens a drawer, and he puts it in the drawer, and he closes the drawer, and he says, Paul, we're not going to talk about this book ever again. We're just going to move on. And I was like, what? This is not what I thought. I thought you were going to, connect with your publishers. But that was crucial because, he took the time to read it, took the time to tell me that it was, an amateur piece of writing. And he remained, a great friend and a mentor until he passed away.
When you were at Condé Nast, you kind of combined your love of golf in an article, The Business of Tiger Woods. So was that the first time you kind of blended, your passion for golf into, your writing for, kind of on the finance side?
Yeah, I think it's probably the second that I can think of. The first was when I was after Bloomberg, I got recruited to the Financial Times by Robert Thompson. And that was, the FT was one of the right time, right place, amazing institution. And Robert is this famous Australian who's now number 2 at Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. And he encouraged us to do all kinds of stuff. So the first time, way beyond our beat. So the first time I did this is I got to meet Greg Norman. This is all before, people have incredibly strong opinions about Greg Norman. And they probably had strong opinions back then too. I just didn't know what those were. And, my next door neighbor growing up, he worked for Spalding, and he would always give me Tour Edition golf balls, which is the golf ball that Greg Norman played. And I remember meeting Greg Norman. He was shilling something. He was talking about his wine. He was talking about a golf course or whatever. And so I wrote sort of a business of Greg Norman, and that was sometime in the mid 2000s. But yeah, Tiger that story was a ton of fun. And Condé Nast portfolio was, I feel like it was the last gasp of the big budget magazines. And it couldn't have had worse timing. It launched in 2007 and it blew through $100 million and folded in 2009. But boy, Jeff, it was a lot of fun before it blew up, And so I followed Tiger all over the country, and that was, it was a really interesting, fun piece to write. And for those who haven't read it, it's essentially about, Tiger was building all these courses in the run up to the Great Recession, to the financial crash. And I met him in North Carolina, where there's this development called the Cliffs, which was an incredibly inspiring story of this guy, Jim Anthony, who was a telephone lineman who started slowly buying land, and, no-name architect for the first one, no-name architect for the second one. And then he had Jack Nicklaus, he had Gary Player. He started getting named architects to build the golf courses in these developments. And then he finally gets, Tiger Woods at the height of his powers. This is Tiger Woods after winning the U.S. Open on a broken leg in 2008. Before we know about all the scandals, before we know about all the back surgeries, before we know about everything else. This is maximum Tiger. And then, as happens in life, the Great Recession happened, and the guy, Jim, lost everything. He absolutely lost, everything, because it was a great lesson in business. He was literally building an imagined community. Like, he was building this thing on the North Carolina, South Carolina border. And, let's say plots of land back then were $500,000. If you went outside the gates, you could buy, 50 acres for $500,000. The land was so cheap, and it just kind of went against him. But that was, it was a fascinating piece. It was fascinating to meet Tiger. And it really segues into how I wrote the book Clutch, because I thought to sell a book proposal, I really needed to get a quote from Tiger. And I did, about how he was so great under pressure. So that trip was super important for me.
Obviously, Tiger, was a generational talent, and besides like everyone else, his flaws and the stuff. But what surprised you about him? Following around the country and writing that article.
I didn't know then what everybody knows now, and that he's super reticent and he's a very difficult interviewer. But what I did, what surprised me was his focus from the beginning. Like, he walked in and was like, "Hey, Paul, Tiger, nice to meet you." And we sat down for half an hour and we talked. And in the final question, he gave me a great answer. And then he stood up and said, "Hey, Paul, that was great." And that little thing, like, when you interview athletes, they don't usually remember your name. I mean, they don't. I mean, and that, like, ability to focus in on, the person in the room, why I was there, what I was going to talk about, and then, go about his business. But that hyper focus, is what in his prime allowed him to be such a great player. And it's also the first trait that I talk about for people who are great under pressure, for people who are clutch.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, golf's fascinating to me. I didn't pick it up till I was in my early 30s, and I played sports and growing up. But I think it's just a mind game. It's you versus you on the golf course. Nobody's chasing you, nobody's throwing a 100-mile-per-hour fastball at you. But I always felt like the difference between the best golfer in the world, or the top 10 or whatever, versus the others is the ability to focus more on each shot over 4 rounds of golf, right? I mean, they're pretty similar in talent. Obviously some people will drive.
It's a great point. And in 2008, when he was at his peak, if you looked at the number 1 golfer in the world, Tiger, and the number 125th golfer, which is the last person to be on the PGA Tour, the difference in their strokes was about 3.5 strokes, which sounds like a lot. But then if you go from the number 2 player in the world to the number 125th player, the difference in their stroke average was like 1.3, 1.4. So everybody except Tiger was so closely bunched together, and Tiger was just so much better. But the point that you made, and it kind of raises sort of 2 answers to that. I asked him, like, how'd you get so great? And he said, look, I've been the equivalent of the last group on Sunday since I was 6 or 7 years old. And I've failed more than other people have seen, but that's where I'm comfortable. That's where I'm most at ease. And, he knew what to do. He didn't always close, but he closed like in the high 90th percentile when he had, the lead. But that came from being there. And the second thing, you talk about, nobody's chasing you. There's a great psychologist who since passed away named Ari Keefe. And Ari Keefe went on to work for big hedge funds, including Stevie Cohn's, which is now Point72, but it used to be SEC. And he worked with traders to help them be better under pressure. But he got his start by working with the U.S. Olympic riflery team, because he went to the U.S. Olympic training camp and he thought, I'm a psychiatrist. This is what I do. Pressure. I've studied this. I can help you. Nobody wanted to talk to him because everybody thought, if I go see a psychiatrist, I'm crazy. Only crazy people go. But the riflery team got it. And they said, how come we perform differently in practice than we do in competition? And it was such a key question, because unlike most every other sport, if you're in a riflery range, nothing should change. I mean, the distance is the same. It's your rifle. That's the same. Obviously, you're armed. Nobody's running at you. This is not like football or basketball. Nothing changes. And so he observed them and he watched them.
Are you drowning in boring corporate communications? Palacio and Partners is here to rescue you. We transform internal podcasts from snooze fest to must-listen content that actually connects your team and strengthens your culture. Imagine podcast episodes that make your employees laugh while staying informed. Our founder, Jeff Palacio, doesn't just create podcasts, he creates conversations that break through the noise. Whether you're a growing startup or a massive corporation, we turn your company's story into audio gold. Leadership becomes human. Remote teams feel connected. Your message cuts through the clutter. Palacio and Partners, where corporate communications gets a fun makeover. Let's make your podcast work harder than your email inbox ever could. Jeff is happy to share his insights on podcasting with you. You can contact him via LinkedIn or schedule a Zoom call via the link in the episode description.
The distance is the same. It's your rifle. That's the same. Obviously, you're armed. Nobody's running at you. This is not like football or basketball. Nothing changes. And so he observed them and he watched them. And what he realized is that they would start to breathe differently in competition than they did in practice. And so he just got them breathing the same way in practice as they did in competition. And it changed, what that team did. And that's how he then went on. Ari Keefe had this amazing career, very lucrative career of doing similar things with portfolio managers who are trying to make, high dollar decisions under extreme pressure.
Using a golf and other analogies, it's to me, it's like, every drive should be perfect because it's
on a tee. Yeah, nobody's coming after you. Yeah.
It's everything,
Yeah, you're standing there.
And same thing with free throws in basketball, right? I mean, you're 15 feet away, You should, so it's very interesting. I know you're talking about your first book, Clutch, why some people excel under pressure or others don't. But what other takeaways in terms of that? Any other insights? I know it's a 250-page book.
Oh, well, I'll tell you, I'll give some of the top traits of people who are great under pressure. Focus is number one. Discipline, which is the ability to stay focused, is number two. There are 5 of them. And number 3 is really important, and that's adaptability. And I really got to understand that in a deeper level when I went up to West Point, to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And I saw how they trained those cadets, because all those young men and women, they're going to get out of West Point and they're going to become lieutenants. They're going to be in charge of people's, lives, and they're going to have to make real-time decisions. And one of the things at West Point, and the military service in general, but this example just happens to be at West Point, one of the things that they do so well is they teach the kids to fail, and they teach the kids, how to make that 3rd, 4th, 5th plan after all the others have failed. And that's the adaptability that you need under pressure. One of the colonels that I talked to up there, he said, look, plans fail, but planning is everything. And it's a good way to go through business, through life. Like, okay, here's my plan A, but let's assume it's going to fail. And when it does, and I have to make a decision, what am I going to do? And too often people aren't thinking ahead. We're too sanguine. We think, oh, this will turn out great. And sometimes it does, which is wonderful, but sometimes it doesn't. And if you haven't thought through not just the plan, but the actual planning, you could find yourself in a situation that you might not need to be in.
Let's talk about when you got the dream job, writing for the New York Times and writing the Wealth Matters column for, I think it was 608 installments.
Yeah, 13 years.
Yeah. Talk about that experience.
It was awesome. It was as good as I hoped it would be. I mean, you're quirky people wherever you work, but the people I work with at the New York Times were all super motivated, super focused, super competitive, super ethical, trying to do the best job they could. And I loved it. But, you think about it, I never started out thinking, oh, boy, one day I'll be here for 13 years, write 608 columns. I just wanted to write the next column. And, it was this will come as a surprise to no one. It's not the easiest place to get a job. There's a lot of vetting. And I was interviewing for it in 2008. And I'll preface this by saying I'm not making any of this up. But I interviewed, my first interview for the job, I'm sitting in the newsroom, was when Bear Stearns was collapsing, because I saw it on the screens as I'm talking to the editor. I found out I was going to create the Wealth Matters column and become a business columnist in New York Times the week that Lehman Brothers collapsed. And then my first column ran the weekend that Bernie Madoff got pulled out of his Park Avenue apartment. I remember the editor calling me the next week, like, yeah, we got this guy Sullivan. He knows everything about money and wealth. And, why didn't he write about Bernie Madoff? And the only thing I knew back then about Bernie Madoff was that he had, created a market maker firm for the NASDAQ and been kind of a technical guy. I didn't nobody knew anything about the Ponzi scheme. And so then it went, I was kind of off to the races, because then you had so much to write about and how you think about money. And it really changed, shaped my perceptions. We'll get into this later, I'm sure, for what became my second book, but it really shaped my perceptions around how people feel about money and how they tack so many emotions, so much, psychology onto money that money doesn't really have intrinsically. And what do I mean by this? There are people who think like, oh, if only I had more money, I would be happier. Or, boy, I really wish I had that person's money. Or the flip side is, man, money has done nothing but cause me problems. And so when you're writing a column called Wealth Matters in 2008, 2009, 2010, when the financial world is going to shit, you get a lot of angry emails. And these emails that people needed to direct their anger at somebody. And I had an email address at the New York Times, and they'd go on the website and they click it to me. And I always remember some of the ones like, I look, back then the rule at the time, so you had to read the emails if they came in. You didn't have to respond. But every so often I'd respond. And 9 times out of 10, when the person would respond back, they would say, I'm really sorry for taking my anger out on you. I didn't actually think anybody would read this email. I just needed to vent. And that really started thinking about, how, money at its most basic is just a means of exchange. It's a vehicle for choice. If you have more of it, you can make more choices. If you have less of it, fewer choices. But it's so fraught with, psychological intent and all the feelings that we have around it, that it shaped, being a columnist at that time during the Great Recession really
Right.
shaped, so much of my thinking, as an adult, as a father, as a husband, because, money is interwoven throughout our lives.
I'm blanking on the author's name. He's a famous author that wrote The Big Short.
Michael Lewis.
Michael Lewis, yes.
Yeah.
Moneyball. Fascinating movie, obviously also, but he's that period was incredible, and we can have a whole podcast around the implications of what happened before and after that still impacts us to this day. But I was fortunate enough to participate in the Heartland Digital Asset Exchange event here in Kansas City, where all these Web3 digital asset, currency, crypto, blockchain experts came to Kansas City. Fidelity was here, and a bunch of other major companies, and Grant Cardone was here. I mean, I got to interview these people on the podcast, and it's just amazing the types of that people really don't understand the money structure today, let alone what's happening in the blockchain digital asset space. So it's I got introduced to a book called The Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth, which is a fascinating read on money and its implications. And
it's not only that people not understand it; that would be fine. But people think that they can figure it out on their own. And I don't understand heart surgery. I know some people are great heart surgeons, but I wouldn't say, you know what? I don't know. I could probably YouTube this and figure out how to do a little heart surgery. When it comes to money, people have day jobs doing something completely different. They think, well, I don't know. Maybe I can do this. Maybe I'll invest on my own. And it becomes the sort of confirmation bias is that people remember, oh, look, I bought NVIDIA 3 years ago. Boy, I made a lot of money, which of course is 100% true. But they forget all the times that they bought stocks that are not NVIDIA, and they did not make the kind of money they made on that. And so we don't treat our personal finances at times with the same rigor that we would, going to a surgeon, or you don't try to, freewheel it on the law. You're like, you know what? Do I need somebody to read this 400-page contract? Nah, I'll just skim it. I'll be fine. You never would do that.
Yeah, and then I know 2015 you wrote The Thin Green Line, The Money Secrets of the Super Wealthy. What did you take out of kind of all that writing for the New York Times, and what do the 1-2% look like versus others? Besides that, they have a hell of a lot more money.
That's it, Jeff. I mean, they have a hell of a lot more money, and the purpose of the column early on, and I try to stay true to it, was to take the strategies of some of the wealthiest, most successful people in America and later, in the world, and see what a regular upper middle class New York Times reader could glean from it. And that was really, the focus. Right now, there were some absurd columns that were just fun. I remember talking to a bunch of women who had perfume made just to fit their own personal scent. Now, nobody making $100,000 a year is going to go do that. But there's other stuff that was way more applicable to the average American. And the biggest one was, how we talk to our kids about the things that mattered. And I came to believe by the end that at times, if you're not careful as a very wealthy person, a middle-class person may have a leg up on you when it comes to communicating financial values to your children. And what do I mean by that? I mean, like, if you're a middle-class person and you have a Honda, and you've had this Honda for 10 years, and it's still running, but it needs a repair that's going to be $5,000, and you think the car is maybe worth $7,000, you're having that discussion, and you own it free and clear. And so when you're discussing together, husband and wife, with kids around the table, about what are we going to do? Are we going to pay this $5,000 to fix the car? Or are we going to buy a new Honda that, let's say, costs $40,000, which will be a $700 a month car payment for the next, 5 or 6 years? And you're really puzzling it out as to what this means. Kids, by, through osmosis, just listening to their parents have that conversation, are learning an awful lot. Now, the flip side of this, if you're a very wealthy person and you decide that you want to buy a new Range Rover, you go and buy it, and the car appears, and your kids don't have any connection as to how you went about buying that really nice car. And I remember this one guy who was in Miami, very wealthy, and he realized that. And so he would walk his daughter through what he had to earn to buy that new Range Rover, how much it cost to insure it, how much it cost to, maintain it, how much it cost to put gas in it. And it was, his way to like teach her, to connect her to the labor that was involved to earn the money to buy the thing that she saw in her driveway. And it was, when people did stuff like that, I'm like, that is super intentional. And that is, taking an eyes wide open approach to life and to family, because, that's how you're going to empower your kids to make good decisions on their own.
I want to start talking about, you founded this organization called the Company of Dads, and we'll weave in kind of how you kind of pivoted out of a full-time writing job, columnist job at New York Times, and started doing freelance for golf articles, which I love. We'll talk about that. But talk about the Company of Dads and that whole story that started when you started having your daughters.
The Company of Dads, started almost 4 years ago, and it's a media company, community platform, and workplace educator with the goal of helping families fulfill their full potential. And so what does that mean? We focus on what we call lead dads. And a lead dad is the go-to parent, whether he works full-time, part-time, or devotes all of his time to his family. In many cases, he's there supporting his spouse or partner, whatever they're doing. We say many because 18% of fathers in the U.S. are divorced, widowed, or otherwise single. And then the last part is we say a lead dad is always an advocate and an ally for working moms and caregivers in the office. And, we give away the media for free. It's a podcast, a newsletter, a great feature called the Lead Dad of the Week, which, Michael Iammarino, who introduced us, he was the Lead Dad of the Week at one point. Community is obvious, both sort of in person and online. And then we generate all of our revenue through corporate talks, through seminars, through appearing at different conferences. And so we'll work with the company's ERGs, we'll work with the company's HR department to help them message the policies they have. How this came about was a longer story. I don't know when this will air, but we're talking in the end of 2025. 12 years ago in 2013, my wife, who works in financial services, said, I want to start my own firm. And I said, oh my goodness, you have to do this. Because if you come back to early parts of our conversation, my life was way better than I ever imagined it being. I was married. I had 2 daughters. I was at the New York Times. My first book, it not only came out, but it did really well. And it introduced me to the world of keynote speaking. Turns out I had an aptitude for that. Literally, I had Labradors. I had 2 Labradors, Jeff. That's the greatest dog ever known to mankind. I now have Bernedoodles. They are not the greatest dog ever known to mankind. And so my life was going swimmingly. And I said, yes, 100%. I'll support you, whatever you want. I said, well, I'm really going to be busy. I'm going to need you to really, we're not going to be able to do this parenting thing 50-50. It's going to be more like, 80-20, if not 90-10 for, the next year or so. I was like, I'm all in. I can do this. And I was able to do it because fortunately, I was a columnist. So everything is, you write a column once a week. Other stuff that I wrote for the Times was planned out. Occasionally you'd have some breaking news, but, I could plan out my schedule. Books take several years to write, and nobody ever calls you up on a Tuesday and says, hey, can you fly to Orlando on Friday and give a keynote talk? Everything in my life was planned out. And I was able to sort of kind of secretly work a bit more from home and not have to go into the office. And when I went in, again, this is 12 years ago, my dad was a lot younger. My dad would come down and he would help shuttle my daughters around. But I say this, during this time, I was an undercover lead dad. And there's no way I was going to blow my cover. And you would say, like, why in the world would you need to be undercover about something like being a lead dad? And, you could boil it down to my own insecurity for sure around, what masculine norms are, around parenting. But what it really came down to is like in my community, I saw lots of moms out there. I saw nannies, I saw au pairs, I saw babysitters, but I rarely saw dads in this role. And if I did see a dad taking his kids to breakfast on a Tuesday, in the waiting room at the pediatrician on a Thursday afternoon, he would look at me and like quickly pick up his phone or open his laptop and pretend to be doing, some work. And in the flip side, in the office, man, Jeff, it was my dream job at the New York Times. There's no way I wanted to screw that up by seeming anything other than 100% committed to what I was doing. Even though I had, a lot of working parents as my editors, as my bosses, I didn't want to put my hand up. And so I, kind of was an undercover lead dad from 2013 to 20, and there's some absurd moments in there. There's this story I've written about and retold several times. But I was talking to a former head of the Council of White House Council of Economic Advisors, so cabinet level position. I was talking to her from the passenger seat of my car in front of the ballet studio, while my dad was with my other daughter at the pediatrician. And I'm talking to this person because, this is pre-Zoom. You could just talk to somebody on the phone. She doesn't know where I am. She assumes that I'm at the New York Times. She doesn't know that I'm sitting in the passenger seat of my car out in front of a ballet studio. And all of a sudden, my dad starts calling. And, you've got kids, Jeff. If the pediatrician calls you, you got to take that call. Because you could call the pediatrician back a minute later and they've evaporated. I don't know where they go, but they're gone. Right. And so I said, shit, what am I going to do? I'm talking to a cabinet level person here. And she, it's a woman with 2 kids, but I was like, I can't be honest about this. And so mid question, I say, you know what? That's an incredible point you made. And it reminds me, and I hang up mid question and take the call from the pediatrician. And now she's calling me back because nobody has hung up on this woman in a good 20, 30 years. This just doesn't happen. And so I sort out everything with the pediatrician. And then I said, okay, take the call. And I said, I can't lie. I'm a New York Times columnist. I can't lie. And so I said, yeah, really sorry that happened. The cell phone service in my town is awful. Where were we? All 2 statements. And so I had all this kind of these workarounds to be at the top of my game as a journalist and, the best lead dad I could be. And of course, when COVID happened, it all fell apart because, my dad is a cancer survivor. So he wasn't coming down to help out anymore. He, like everybody, he was afraid he was going to get it. And he had throat and neck cancer. And so he get it and die. So understood that, there's no school. So my kids, I then had 3, they were at home. That's not great for working. And then I was pretty sure there wasn't going to be any summer camp that year. And those were, those 3 things, those are the 3 pillars of how I was able to be a lead dad and a columnist and an author and a public speaker. And so at that time, and then my wife was super stressed because working in financial services in April of 2020, you think, is this going to be 2008 all over again? Is everything I built going to just go away? And so I did what I think most people would do in a crisis when they didn't have answers. I went to the source of all knowledge in the universe, Google. And Google told me that there was lots of stuff for moms, every flavor of group for moms. It also told me that all the stuff for parents was really for moms. And then it told me that any dad seeking advice was somehow broken. He drank too much. He'd been incarcerated. He'd been through a messy divorce. There wasn't anything positive. Now, remember, I love golf. I was able to weasel my way into being the 5th string golf writer for the New York Times, in addition to being a columnist. I could nerd out in golf on so many different ways. By that point, I'd written 2 books. Obviously, I love reading. I could nerd out in books in so many different ways, but there wasn't a positive forum for me to engage as a father and more importantly, to get support, to get honest support from people who had been through this already. And that was kind of the start of it. And I did what you would do as a columnist. I said, I wonder how many guys in the United States fit my definition of lead dad. And it was 1/3 of all fathers. So 25 million men, 1/3 of all fathers are lead dads. And it's being driven by the guys in their 30s who want to find a way to work differently so that they can be more present and more involved in their kids' life. Doesn't mean they're still not working at a high level, but they want to, find a way to share that parenting labor with their spouse or partner. And that was really the start of it. And, over 15 months, I'm a risk averse guy, so I wasn't inclined to leave the New York Times. It was an amazing job. It was a great career. But over the next 15 months, just, talking to people, talking to working moms, how did they figure it out? Trying to talk to dads, how they figured it out. And then, seeing what was happening in companies, talking to companies, and knowing from having been a business journalist for so long and giving a lot of corporate talks, knowing that the one thing that I knew to be 100% true is that companies would screw up the work from home, return to office mandate. They would royally screw it up because they would be too heavy handed. They would misunderstand what people wanted. Like that was, if I had any insight, and it's proven out, any insight, I was like, there's no way they get this. Even well-meaning companies, they would not get this right. And so cobbling all that together, that became the genesis for the company of dads. And I left the New York Times almost exactly 4 years ago from the point of this conversation and launched the company of dads a few months after that.
Yeah, having been a longtime corporate person working for companies, over 1 million employees and small companies, 16 employees and everything in between. I'm very curious, like how you go into this environment, kind of the corporate world. I mean, which you hadn't been in. I mean, obviously you wrote articles about CEOs and people with money, but like, what were the big surprises there? I mean, you called it, like, even today, you know, we're 5 years, you know, past when COVID started, give or take. And people, like you said, companies are still not getting it right. You know, now you see the pendulum swinging to the other side, 5 days in the office, you don't like it, get another job. So I'm just curious, kind of, what was the big surprises trying to help companies, you know, doing what the company of dads does?
A great question. Tell me, I mean, you know, I thought about since Clutch when I try to figure out why some people choked under pressure, because the opposite of Clutch is often choking. And I sort of compared two bank CEOs at the time, and assuming that both were equally well educated, equally credentialed, equally experienced, or else they would not be CEOs of the bank, and then kind of dissecting, you know, why they failed. So the New York Times is not a big company. It has many employees, but is a super efficient, you know, workplace. You know, but having, you know, been a business journalist, having, you know, spent a lot of time at companies, because companies are the ones that pay you to give keynote talks, and understanding their process going in there, what I assume would happen, and it's borne out, is that CEOs and CHROs and people managers, they would not do the thing that every journalist knows to do, and that is to ask the question, why do you want that? Why do you want that now? What is that for? And instead, they would fall back, and this is, you know, behavioral finance 101. They would have an anchoring bias, and they'd say, okay, in February of 2020, everything was running great. Everybody was in the office. We had these workers. They left their family home. I'm exaggerating, of course. We're just going to go back to that. Well, once that genie was let out of the box, there was no way you were putting that genie back in, because we went from a culture in which, if you think of the language, if somebody said to you on a Friday, I'm going to work from home, they weren't going to work from home. They were going to go get ready for a fishing trip. They were going to go play golf. They were going to get a head start on a family vacation. Pretty soon, when people said, I'm going to work from home, it meant they're going to work from home. And if you had a leader say pre-COVID, I'm going to go take some time to be with my family, you knew that what that really meant was he'd been shit-canned. But he didn't want to say that he'd been shit-canned. So he said, I'm going to go spend some time with my family. And pretty quickly, all of the language began to take on a different form. And there's sort of an iconic person in the work from home movement known around the world as BBC Dad. And this is a guy who is sitting in Korea on the BBC, not about 18 months before COVID happened. And he's being interviewed about some esoteric part of Korean finance. And his kids come in the background. And you see his kids coming in, and he is on this satellite hookup with the BBC. And then you see his wife come in afterwards and try to pull those kids out as if they were pythons about to strangle the man giving this interview. And it goes viral because this guy doesn't break character. He is like, and there's shit going on. All the kids are there. The mom is pulling them out. Does not break character. If that happens, you know, during COVID, that happened all day, every day. And what the best CEOs, the best leaders realize is that, okay, I have these people here because they can do a job at a high level and they are parent. It's not, you know, they're doing their job, but they are parent. And the best ones, and look, to be quite honest, like the companies that are having me come in and talk are the best companies. These are the ones who want to refine good things that they're already doing, because there are plenty of companies that don't want to admit yet that what they're doing is going to have a negative impact. And these companies are trying to say, okay, you know, I mean, Chicago, University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, the business of business is business. There was this time when you were supposed to go to work, be the model worker, leave everything at home. COVID blew the lid off that. That's not going to happen. And so now we have to, you know, work in a different way. Where I'm very empathetic to leaders is most time when there's a change as radical as this, where there's the possibility of working in a different way, it happens gradually. It happens over a decade or more. Think of like the introduction of the personal computer, the introduction of the cell phone. I mean, that essentially allowed people to leave work at 5 o'clock and then go home and finish. Before that, you would have to wait at work to 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock until somebody called you on your landline at work. That was a gradual change. The change in COVID was instant. People had to figure out how to work, and they weren't equipped for it. Now, the best CEOs, the best leaders, like, okay, how can I take the best of in-person and the best of work from home and make something positive for my company? Others are like, well, this is how we always used to do it. And I've got a beautiful office building that I just paid $3 billion to build. So I think you should come in and work here every day, because I do.
We could have a whole podcast on this. I thought it was crazy, even in the early 90s when I was at Sprint, now T-Mobile. I had these data analysts, data scientists working for me. We were basically a new group doing predictive modeling to do better marketing for consumer long distance customers. And I had people work at home then. Sprint didn't even have work at home policy, but I'm like, these people can dial in and code, they had a daughter that was sick. He was a single dad. He got divorced. He goes, Jeff, can I work at home? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And this was the early 90s. I'm like, and I couldn't believe companies I work with, at the same time, I would literally leave the office at 4:30 and I walk a shame because I had to go pick up my kids at the daycare. I had literally been in that office 12 hours straight. I still felt bad because I'm leaving early in air quotes here, but I applaud what you're doing and I think it's fantastic. How can people learn more about the Company of Dads or, be a part of it? And
Thanks for asking. The website is thecompanyofdads.com, thecompanyofdads.com. And if you want an easy way to sort of get a sense of what we're doing, we have a newsletter comes out every Sunday morning called The Dad, and that's just thecompanyofdads.com/The Dad. And we promise it only comes out once a week, and it'll give you, 5 or 6 articles to read at your leisure, listen to, and just get a sense of, what we're doing and why it matters, not just for dads, but for the whole family.
Yeah. I saw possibly on your website, is there a book in the works on the Company of Dads?
Yeah, there's a book in the works. My agent is selling the book now, and it really goes through how you could be a super involved dad in the different spaces where we exist today, at home, in the office, in that space between home and office as a manager. And so it really breaks down sort of actionable advice to sort of live, a more fulfilled life and be more involved as a parent and a spouse.
Paul, I love to help two groups of people. One group, after they graduate either high school or college or their master's program, and they're getting that first job. What advice do you have for them as they try to obtain that first job as well as beginning their career?
Yeah, ask a lot of questions. Always ask a lot of questions. And it's actually one area where I would say, if at all possible, you're single, you've just started working, soak up that office culture. I'm not anti-office culture. Soak up that mentoring and, stay late and try to figure out, that person seems to have a job that I would like one day. How did that person get the job? And then the flip side is, if you look around the office in your first job and say, God, I don't want any of these jobs. Don't stay. Don't stay. Get out. Find and ask other questions and find another job, because too many people get trapped into something and but always ask questions.
Yeah. I tell when recent college graduates ask me for advice, I always say, look, people still are scarred from getting their first job and the whole process. They'll be kind to you because they remember how bad it was.
Oh, so yeah.
Ask for help, ask their advice. It's all good. The second group is, anybody can be a leader at a company. You don't have to have direct reports, but those that take that step from individual contributor to now have a group of people on an org chart that are responsible for that very first time, what advice would you have for them?
Be open and honest. And we've shown this in our research and in the talks that we give to companies. When you're open and honest about who you are as a leader, it doesn't show weakness, it shows strength. And it allows people to feel like they can come to you and talk. And so in our little niche here around, parenting, we've had, pretty senior leaders who've started to put on their calendars, not OOO for out of office. They've put very specific things about what they're doing with their son, their daughter, their spouse. And that really helps to reinforce the broader policy that company might have around, the whole employee, or we support you for what you're doing. But that doesn't come from a policy handbook. It doesn't come from an HR briefing. It comes when a leader, whether that person is leading 3 people, 30 people, or 3,000 people, when that person is open and honest and they feel like, okay, I can see myself in that person. And I believe that he or she really means what he or she is saying.
Paul, thank you so much for coming on the Corporate Couch. I love your career. I love what you're doing with the Company of Dads. And, I told you when we first met via Zoom that, being a dad's been the greatest joy of my life. So thank you for what you're doing.
Jeff, thanks for having me on. And I have to apologize for one thing. If people are watching the video here, I've been standing the entire time at my standing desk. I should have been on a couch. I feel like I wasn't on brand here. So
I appreciate that, Paul. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Paul Sullivan. Paul was just fantastic. I don't know. I mean, one of the favorite episodes for me in terms of just the breadth of the conversation. It starts with how he did a book report in 5th grade on mice and men, and worked for the New York Times as a writer. That whole story, his first day, right when he started, the Bear Stearns collapse. He was hired as Lehman Brothers was falling. The first column ran the weekend. Bernie Madoff was arrested. Tiger Woods, following Tiger Woods during his dominant period across the country. And even Tiger remembered his name. And I loved, I thought this was great. I asked about, where he grew up and all that. And he goes, he was in Ludlow, Massachusetts, exit 7 off the Massachusetts Turnpike. What was fun for me growing up was dreaming of never living there again.
Moved away and never looked back.
that started the episode. I'm like, damn, that's funny. I mean, everybody has different things. I was neutral. I mean, when I grew up, New York State was had the highest retention rate. Like if you were born in New York State, you did not leave it. So I was an outlier because when I graduated college, I came out to Kansas City. I never, my hometown was fine. Obviously not Paul's experience. Yeah, there were so many good things. I mean, starting in the writing for Bloomberg and other, just the old time editors are smoking cigarettes and cigarellos and still working at 9 p.m. to make a deadline. The editor just yelling at everybody, making novice reporters, columnists call back their sources and admit they didn't understand something to explain it. This lead dad concept, and he starts this company of dads. I mean, we have a shared experience, being divorced parents at one time. And, I don't know if I was a lead dad, but I did a lot and I had my kids over 50% of the time. But I definitely thought, what a great concept, of starting that and helping people, helping, dads that, are, handling, over 50% or 89% of the parenting. And really he was doing that role, and then COVID hit, and that he just basically said, that's when he started a company of dads. Cause that's people, there was no school, no summer camp, no grandparent help because they were, COVID, older people were, targets for COVID, more susceptible, and then that's when he realized 25 million men are lead dads, and there was no positive space for them. And he knew companies were going to botch work from home transitions, which obviously came true. So I don't know, just overall, I think I even said at the end of the episode, I could have talked to Paul all day long.
It was absolutely great. I love this episode. Certainly one of the finer episodes that we've ever recorded. He's an incredible person and an incredible interview. He went on so many things. You hit most of them. When he was talking about golf is mental. One of the things that's interesting about golf is that it's one of the few subset of sports for which there really is no defense. It's just you against you. There's golf, there's perhaps darts, bowling, and maybe a couple of others that are like that is just you. Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is that if that's really true, why don't you hit a hole in one every time you tee off? I mean, the conditions are absolutely perfect for it. You said the ball is actually sitting up on a tee, when you do that. Why don't you bowl a strike every time that you go bowling, if that's all it is?
Because I've had too many beers.
Because you had too many beers. If it really is just you against you, why isn't that true? Why don't you bowl a 300 every time? The answer is, I think, that the brain is a very messy place. And it's a very complicated place. But it's a place that can be trained. And that's one of the things that he was wanting to do, is to make sure that you trained this brain so that when you go out into the world and there really are things with a defense, when there really are people that are literally against you succeeding, that at least you've conquered your inner battles. At least you've done that, and you can go on and tackle everything else. I think the whole interview was just an amazing interview. I loved it. I loved him. I loved talking to him. It was just a great experience.
Yeah, so fun. Joe, give me an update on the life of Joe right now.
Well, we're getting ready for Valentine's Day in a little bit, and that's kind of a sensitive subject around me. I've had to come to the conclusion that it's okay if I don't get a Valentine on Valentine's Day, because after all, I didn't get a groundhog on Groundhog's Day.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.